Okay, so now what I want to do is make a copy of this terrain, because we're going to have another terrain in the back. So the easiest way to do this is Control-C, Control-V, copy-paste. Switch over to Move, and if you take a look in this top view, being able to see where the camera angle is, we can see the extent of the camera in all of the views, and that's really helpful. So I'm not going to keep this terrain as a complete duplicate. Just use it to start out with. Go ahead and scale that up. And I'm also going to stretch it a little more on the y-axis. So if we edit the terrain, we'll also see that stretching within the viewport. And I did stretch it on the y, and I'm going to resize the terrain. Now, because it is farther away, we don't need as high of a resolution. So I would normally bring it down to 512 by 512. But since it's not square anymore, and we scaled it on the y, I'm going to change the x, because it starts with x and y, and change the x to 512. And click OK. And this will prevent any horrible looks on the terrain, any stretching based on pixels. And I'm going to click the mountain preset, use a little diffusive erosion, add some stones. And that should be okay. So we can click OK, and now we can see we have these two terrains. And I will also want to have another terrain for the ground. I don't want to use a ground plane. We have this in the scene right now by default, and I'm going to keep it there just as kind of a fallback in case the camera view does go to the point where it's beyond the terrains and we need to see behind it, but we don't want to populate an ecosystem on that. So once again, I can take and make another copy of the terrain. Control-C, Control-V, copy-paste, or you can go up to the top, edit, copy, and paste. And this terrain, and now I did copy the front one because I have that pixel resolution as square, and I'm going to use the scale gizmo to size this down and make it a little flatter. We can push it back. I'm still using the global coordinate mode. We'll switch over to the top view, and I just want to pull this up, and we can take a look at it. And I just want to go ahead and smooth this out slightly. Just using diffusive. And then I'm going to reduce the resolution to 512 by 512 because we really don't need it to be that high. There's not a lot of elevation, and we are going to be applying an ecosystem overall to it. So before we load any materials in, let's go ahead and rename these terrains. And you can click on the name with it selected. Double-clicking will edit the object. So if you click, wait a second, click again, you can rename it, or you can right-click, go to rename, and it's going to pull up object renaming box where you can name the terrain. And I'm just going to call this front. And then rename the back one, back, rename ground, and since I don't want to have two objects called ground, I'm just going to call it ground terrain with an underscore. Now I also want to work with a different camera aspect ratio. So if we go up to the top, where we can access the render options, we can right-click on this camera and pull up our overall render options. Now, pretty much everything's grayed out because we have render in main view set, which is automatically going to render to the viewport. If I select render to screen, then it's going to pull up a new window, and we can define some of these different settings for the scale of the render. But we can still change the aspect ratio either way. So I'm going to keep it in the main view and change my aspect ratio to 16:9. And I'm going to set my render quality to final. So it's a little bit better than that preview render. We can get some anti-aliasing in there. It'll look a lot better. Not suggested for animation, but as a nice preview, it's going to work out pretty well. So now we can see the frame guides have increased in size. And if we go up to this first button in the view, we can select frame guides and choose whether or not we want to display these framing strips. You can also display a grid and safe frames. So there's a lot of different options there for editing and modifying the look. If you need something to help reference while you're working. And just to make sure that everything stays in view, you can also set up your field grid, which unfortunately is based on the entire view and does not constrain to the pixel aspect. So I'm going to turn off the field grid and just keep the action safe frame on. So it's more of the outside frame. And we can select that front terrain, scale it up a little. And I just want to make sure that these edges and flat planes are underneath the other terrain and our ground terrain. And we can modify the height if you want to make it a little more uneven. But we can see that we have it completely in the view. I am going to scale it down, keep it within the camera range, but not have it extend too far out. Add a little more variation. And these little spots that are popping up from the other terrain, those will be okay. If some of those are coming out, you just want to make sure that edge isn't showing, because it will create some strange shadows and whatnot. And if we bring it down a little lower, they will disappear. So either way, that should be good. That back terrain, I do want a little larger. So I'm going to scale it up, but I also want to push it back. And we can use the top view for this, kind of switching back and forth. So now we have a much more distant terrain with a nice close terrain. So looking at a render, it's very basic. And all I did was just left click on this camera to render what I have set to render the view. Now the difference between rendering to the view this way and also using the quick render option is that it will not display the framing strips within the preview render. And I do want to see the aspect ratio and what's going to be cut out and what's actually in the frame. So it's very basic. The terrains are smoothed out. They look pretty good, but they do need, of course, a nice looking material. So we're going to start by working on a material. And I do want to have kind of an overall material for all of these terrains, adjusting them slightly as we go, but starting out with kind of a basic overall material for all of them. So what we can do is select first the front using the layers, hold down Shift, and select the ground. So that's going to select everything in between. And now we can load in a material. There are a lot of ways to load materials. Because we want to be specific to these objects, and because the ground plane is also containing the same material, we can't use the material summary. So up at the top, if we show the material summary, it's going to show one material in the scene, the default. Now this applies to every object, including the ground, so 3 terrains and the ground. So if we were to modify and load a material this way, it's also going to include the ground in that, and I do want that material to be separate. So what we can do is up here in the Aspect tab, there's an option to load a material, lower right hand corner. Not all the way down, because that's your preview options, where you can change the display of these objects You can also hide them when they're not selected, and lock them as well. We'll go back to smooth shaded, but we're going to click on this little checkered sphere with the arrow to load in a material. And this is the View Visual Browser, and allows you to access your different libraries, and this is all default right now. You can also add new collections of your own materials you create, or if you purchased any, you can add a new collection and then select the folder. Locate it, and I'm going to select my content folder, and then you can set a name for it. What I like to do is have a global folder for all of my content, and in different areas of the program, this visual browser is available. Materials, also vegetation, scenes, atmospheres. It will automatically pull out the associated files. So you could select the global folder, which in this case I have called asileFX View Content, and then it'll pull up all of my materials that I have. Because the scenes are ignored, anything that doesn't have a .mat extension. So I'm going to go to the View installation, and the default content that comes with View. I also want to note about the cornucopia content. If you take a look at the little ghost here on the bottom, I have it set to hide all cornucopia items. Yours might be set by default to the cornucopia logo, which will show items that are available on cornucopia for purchase. You can show a small selection of them. I'm just going to hide them and just show what's on my system. Now there are different types of materials you can use. Landscapes will contain a lot of mixed material types. And then material layers are individual layers that can be layered on top of each other. These material types can really determine how the overall terrain is going to look, the overall surface, and also how you can edit it and load in additional materials. So we're going to start by loading in the grass and rock preset, and click OK. And we'll just take a look at a quick render before we do anything. And we can tell immediately that the surface and the material scale is far too small. So by default we have a scale set to 1. What I want to do is increase that to 50. So we can set the material scale, type in an amount of 50, go ahead and render it again, and we can see a huge difference once this is finished up. We can definitely see a lot more of the bump within the rock surface, and then being distributed throughout the terrains is also a grass material. There's a lot of different controls for this. We'll take a look at it in just a sec. I do want to make this slightly larger, so I'm going to bring the scale up to 100. And just do a quick preview. We'll be able to see the rock surface looking a little bit better. So now if we want to edit this material, since we have all the objects selected, we can just double click on the material preview up in the aspect tab. If you don't have anything selected in the scene, and I'm going to make sure I turn off that hidden option which I had. If nothing is selected, you can pull up the material summary and now access all of the materials that way. So we can pull up the grass and rock. There are other ways to access materials too. We'll take a look at those in just a sec. First of all, this is a mixed material. It is controlled by a distribution fractal, or in this case, noise nodes. Now, to get to the function editor and to modify the distribution between material 1 and material 2, you can either control-click on the preview and edit all of the different functions, whether or not you want to use noise nodes or fractal nodes, and make any modifications within the function editor. We'll go over that a little more in depth later, just because the function editor can be a little confusing. So we'll look at that a little more later. But basically, if you want, you can double-click to load in existing functions that are available, distributions, and really any of these will work to control the distribution between the surface. Basically, the preview we're seeing is black and white. White being one of the materials and black being the other. So when we see a grayscale, that's a distribution that would be in between. There's also a mixing proportion up on top. So we can go more towards material 1, which will give us more rock, or more towards material 2, which will give us a little more of the grass showing up. The material mixing method, there's a couple of different types, and there's a smooth blending strip, which is a gradient and a smoothing between the surfaces. So whether you want it to cut off very sharply or smooth and blend into it, you can adjust this strip. Now if we want to see a little bit of a better preview, we can select the zoom option. This is going to pull up a little render. We can rescale this material preview and click render to see a preview. We can also change the type. If we go to options, since we're working on a terrain, we can change it to the terrain mode. This will help us better adjust influence and environment effects, which we'll look at in just a second. And I'm going to change the background type to uniform, get rid of that checkered look. We can also see there's a 2D plane if you want to look directly down, or more of a perspective view of an XY plane. There's cone, cylinder, and the marble mode has been removed if you're used to working with previous versions of Vue. There's also a cloud mode if you're working on clouds. So we're going to stick with the terrain. And we can see under the influence of environment that we have a distribution of materials dependent on local slope, altitude, and orientation. So we can adjust whether or not material 2 appears more at low altitudes or high altitudes, what the influence of the altitude is on the material. And I'm going to turn that up a little so that the grass is showing on that ground terrain and that no rock is showing on it. Whether or not we want material 2 on steep surfaces and the influence of the slope, or on flat surfaces. And at any time you can also go and swap the two materials in order to switch them. And we can also set up an influence of orientation. So it'll display on one side of the terrain. And then we can control the direction in which it shows. So I'm going to turn that off, no influence, which means that this material 2 appears near azimuth is null. It no longer impacts the look of the material, unless this top slider is on. A couple of different altitude ranges, global, absolute, per object. Since we have 3 objects, I'm going to stick with global. And we're also going to note that in the mapping mode, we have it set to world standard. A lot of different mapping modes available based on object scales at the moment. With the world mode, we're going to be based on the world coordinate system. So if we move the terrain, it is going to move through the material, which is based on different fractals. We can open up the individual materials by double-clicking on them. And now we can see the setup of our mixed materials and the individual layers within the mixed material. So we have material 1, material 2, and you can add additional layers if you want to stack on top of that. I'm just going to delete that for now, and we're going to stick with just these default settings, except for that slight change we made to the influence of altitude, which is to set it material 2 appearing more at low altitude, and then a slight influence on that, just so the bottom and that bottom terrain isn't really going to show that rock surface. Now, because that back terrain we have is huge compared to the front one, we're not really seeing as much of the rock. So we can go back, maybe reduce that amount a little bit lower, just a very small influence. And we'll start to see that surface coming back. Now if we take a look at the grass, because we're using that standard terrain, it's very smooth, and we're really going to need to rely on bump in the bump output in order to see a little bit better. So if we go back to the material, and I also want to note that we're not using the basic material editor. If you go to the basic material editor, we lose all of those options. I am using the advanced material editor, which has much more available and is really the best to work with at pretty much all times. So what I want to do is modify material 2. We're going to go to the bump. We can see it's set to 0.5, but I can tell by the fact that this is just gray that there is no bump. So if I right click, go to edit function, we can see the bump channel output. And we could choose to load in by double clicking and maybe a terrain altitude or different bumps that are available. But instead, what I'm going to do is connect. What we can also do, remember, is control click, and we can see what's generating the color surface, which is a grainy fractal. And if we go up to the top where we have the zoom options, I can go ahead and zoom in, and we can see this grainy fractal is connected to some different color variations. But what I want to do is take this bump output and connect it to the grainy fractal. But if you take a look, there's also a filter in between adjusting, so I do want to connect to that filter instead. Once I click and hold down, we have this selection arrow. We can go ahead, move it over this highlighted circle, and now our bump is connected to the same control as the color. And provided the function scale within color production and bump are the same, it will match up. Now I can also tell, because the scale of our material being at 100, the depth is way too high. You can even see in the material preview that's way too high for grass. So I'm going to bring it down and type in 0.1. And we can also click render, and which will automatically close out the material editor and then reopen it once the render is complete. But I can see just by the smallest part of the render being completed that that bump is still way too high. So I can hit escape, and that's going to pull everything back up. I'm going to type in a value of 0.02 because we're working with such a high or large scale. And you can also see in that main camera preview and get a good idea of what it's going to look like. So now I'll just do a quick preview render. We're still going to see a very high bump, so maybe we will need to reduce that a little bit more or change the scale of the bump. So I'm going to go back, select material 2, 0.001 or just 0.01, and the bump scale I'm going to set to 0.5, which is the overall scale based on the axes and not the depth amount. And if we go back to that mixed material, I'm going to set the blending mode or the mixing method to cover and adjust that smooth blending strip to 20%. And we're going to see how that's going to look. We might need to just kind of customize that a little bit more because that scale just looks like it's really impacting the overall bump amount. So instead, what I'm going to do, instead of messing around and keep having to make these scale changes, the fastest thing is really going to be to go into the function and modify it. So let's go back to the material summary. And since I want to go straight to the grass, I should close out the material summary. And next to where we have our layers tab and objects, we can also select the material tab, which is going to show every single material in the scene. And in the lower right, we can change the scale of the preview. So now we can directly access which material we want to work on. And what I'm going to do is right click, edit this filter, and if we move the mouse over to the upper right, we can affect the output by moving that point down, clicking and pulling it down. We could also turn on the grid, and we could rescale this filter if we needed to. So we're starting with -1, and it goes up to a +1, which is basically the range that we have within View for controlling a numeric output, which the bump is numeric. Anything you see as grayscale is a numeric output. And I'm just going to pull that down, and that's really going to reduce the bump amount. But still remain in the scene. And if we had to modify the scale a little more, we can. But for the most part, it's starting to look a lot better. Now we have lost a bit of the rock, probably because of the blending mode. So we can go back to the main object and bring down that influence of altitude a little more. And I'm going to turn off that slope influence, which looks like it's really making a dramatic change. You can also click on that main camera preview while you're making changes, and it will update. You can also pull out this bar and make the main camera preview larger. So if you don't want to use the zoom and that preset default terrain, you can view the actual scene, and if it doesn't update automatically, you can just click on the preview and it will update. And we'll just see those changes showing. So there's quite a bit you can do with that. We could also modify this distribution fractal. Make it a little smaller since we have the overall scale of the material so large. So there's a lot of different ways to really modify this. Adjust the mixing between. But this should be good. I'm going to switch this back to a simple blend. And click OK. And just rescale this back. And we can take a look at a quick render. So this material isn't amazing looking, but it is looking a little better. Now, let's say we wanted to swap out what is called gray clumps as the material for the rocky surface. What we can do is double-click on that material to open it up. And now if we double-click on the preview, it'll allow us to load in a different material. So let's switch over to material layers, and this way we know we're working with one layer and not a mixed material or stacked materials. I'm going to switch to the large scale rock. And because we're not placing this on top of another material, it's just by itself, it's saying that because there's an alpha, and what that's going to do is cut out pieces of the material to display a transparency and blend. But because it's the only surface that will be showing in this area, it's going to show holes. So we're going to ignore the alpha information. Click yes to ignore the alpha information. And now we're going to see a different material on top of and replacing where those gray clumps were. And maybe something that looks a little bit better. So we could switch the grass if we wanted to as well.